The letter of Barnabas raises a set of important questions about the relationships between Christians and Jews in antiquity. As we saw in the previous lecture, Barnabas is opposed to the Jewish religion. He maintains that Jews broke the covenant that God had made with them as soon as it was given, and that it was never restored. As a result, Jews were misled by an evil angel into thinking that their laws were to be taken literally instead of figuratively. Jews, therefore, have never worshipped God in a way that's appropriate to Him, according to Barnabas. For him, it's the Christians, the followers of Jesus, who correctly understand the law of Moses and do what it requires. Jews, therefore, for Barnabas, are not the true people of God. One might wonder why Barnabas is so obsessed with showing that Christians, rather than Jews, are people of the covenant, people who belong to the God of Israel. Ultimately, the answer has to do with Christianity's own historical roots. For the Christian religion started out as a sect of Jews. Jesus himself was a Jew, as were his 12 disciples. After his death, these Jewish followers of Jesus formed a distinctive sect within Judaism. They met in the synagogues. They followed Jewish customs. They still considered themselves to be Jews. And so, one of the most salient questions for historians of antiquity: how is it that a Jewish sect became an avidly anti-Jewish religion all within a century? To answer the question, we need to return to the beginnings of Christianity in the life and ministry of Jesus himself. As you probably know, there's an enormous range of scholarly opinion today about how to understand the life of Jesus, to know what he actually said and did. Scholars who have devoted their entire lives to the project of understanding the historical Jesus have come up with radically different solutions. This is an interesting phenomenon in itself. Why is it that otherwise intelligent people who are highly trained are able to look at the same sources and come up with such radically different conclusions? These are people, by the way, who are quite learned. In order to be a scholar of the historical Jesus, to be a serious scholar of the historical Jesus, one has to be able, of course, to read both Greek and Hebrew, but also one should be able to read Aramaic, and one should, because that was the language that Jesus spoke. Greek was the language the Gospels were written in. Hebrew was the language of the Old Testament. Moreover, it's good to be able to read Latin because many of the traditions are preserved in Latin, and Coptic because Coptic is the language of some of the ancient Gospels are written in. And you can probably throw in a couple more ancient languages, not to mention French and German, because you have to read what other European scholars have said about Jesus. So these people who are investigating the historical Jesus are very highly trained, and many of them are very, very smart, and they come up with radically different interpretations. Some claiming that Jesus is best understood as a Jewish rabbi, some that he's best understood as a Palestinian holy man, some that he's best seen as a Jewish cynic philosopher, some claiming that Jesus was a Jewish apocalyptic prophet. The reason for all of these differences, by the way, has to do with the nature of our sources. Our source material for understanding who Jesus really was is not adequate for historians who want to make a complete reconstruction. And these sources can be read in a variety of ways and interpreted in a variety of ways, so the people who devote themselves to the task come up with a variety of interpretations. The one thing that virtually all scholars are agreed on, however, is that however Jesus is to be understood, ultimately, he must be understood as a first-century Jew living in Palestine. Jesus was born Jewish, and he was raised Jewish. He followed Jewish customs. He kept the Jewish law. He became a Jewish teacher. He acquired Jewish followers, whom he taught his own vision of what it meant to be an observant Jew, one who truly kept the law of God that God had given to the Jewish people through Moses. We find this throughout the earliest sources we have for the historical Jesus, that Jesus is thoroughly Jewish. Just to give you one kind of key example, a key moment in the life of Jesus for those engaged in this kind of historical research. Jesus at one point in his ministry is asked by a Jewish scribe, in other words, an expert in the Jewish law, what is the summary of the law? What is the most important commandment of the law? And Jesus replies, the most important commandment of all is that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. A quotation from Deuteronomy chapter 6. But then he goes on to say, and the second commandment is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. A quotation from Leviticus chapter 19. Love God above all else, love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets, says Jesus. It's a mistake to think that Jesus himself came up with the idea that you should love your neighbor as yourself. This is a quotation from the Torah, from the law of Moses. Jesus understood himself as an interpreter of the law of Moses, as a teacher who understood the essence of the law of Moses and tried to convey this essence to his followers, who then were expected to follow the law of Moses. Throughout his lifetime, Jesus preached his message to Jews. And at the end of his life, he was executed by the Romans for claiming to be the Jewish king. And by the way, when you read accounts of the historical Jesus by scholars, one of the pressure points that you want to pay particular attention to is the relationship that is portrayed between Jesus' life and his death. Because if you can't make coherent sense of his execution for claiming to be king of the Jews on the basis of what the reconstruction of his life is, then the reconstruction is probably wrong. In other words, the most secure thing we know about Jesus, the one thing that everybody agrees on, is that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate. If you reconstruct his life in such a way that you can't really explain why Pontius Pilate wanted to crucify him, then you've got a problem. And some of these explanations that scholars have given don't explain very well why Jesus got crucified for being king of the Jews. If you say that Jesus was a Jewish rabbi who was really only principally concerned about loving one another, well, why did Pilate kill him? Was it against the Roman law to love one another? Oh, you want people to love one another? To the cross. Well, no, that doesn't exactly make sense. Was it because Jesus said, love your enemies, and Romans didn't want to be loved? They wanted to be hated? Oh, you can't love us. We'll kill you if you love us. Well, that doesn't make sense. So any reconstruction of who Jesus really was has to make sense of his death, just as a side note, because he was executed for being called King of the Jews. For this lecture, what's important is that from beginning to end, Jesus was thoroughly Jewish. So too were his earliest followers, who continued to keep his instructions about the law and continued, according to our earliest records, to worship in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Even decades after Jesus' death, many of his followers continued to insist that in following Jesus they had found the secret to keeping the Jewish law and observing the Jewish religion in the way the Jewish God wanted them to. Decades after his death, there were Christians who were saying that you have to be a follower of Jesus, the Jew, by being Jewish. This can be seen, for example, in one of our later Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew. Now, Matthew was written about 50 years after Jesus' death. Nonetheless, it seems to embody many of Jesus' own concerns with regard to the Jewish law. Matthew is above all concerned to show that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah sent from the Jewish God to the Jewish people in fulfillment of the Jewish Scriptures. In other words, this gospel goes out of its way to emphasize Jesus' Jewishness. What's striking is that in this gospel, unlike some of the other gospels we have, Jesus continually emphasizes the need to observe the Jewish law. As he says in an important passage in chapter 5, at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says to his disciples, "Don't think that I've come to abolish the law. I've come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. Truly I tell you, every letter of the law, every stroke of a letter of the law will not pass away until all has been fulfilled." He goes on to say that his followers have to keep the law even better than the scribes and the Pharisees if they want to enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, the scribes and Pharisees were very good at keeping the law. This is what they committed themselves to doing. Jesus' followers have to keep it even better than the scribes and the Pharisees. It would be a mistake to think that Matthew didn't really mean this. One common interpretation of Matthew is that what Jesus did, this is the interpretation that people sometimes give, is that in Matthew, Jesus tries to show that the law can't be kept, and therefore, if you can't keep the law, you need Jesus. In fact, Matthew gives no indication that that's what he's thinking. When Matthew intensifies the law and says that you have to keep the law better than the scribes and the Pharisees, he seems to be assuming that it's possible. He never says you can't do it. For example, the famous antitheses in Matthew, where Jesus states one of the laws and then gives his interpretation of it, which is a radical interpretation of it because it radicalizes the command of the law. These antitheses begin with such comments as, the law says you shall not murder, but I say to you, you shouldn't be angry at another. The law says you shall not commit adultery. I say to you, you should not lust after another. The law says to fulfill your vows when you swear an oath. I say don't swear at all. Don't swear an oath at all. Well, these are intensifications of the law because it's obviously much harder not to get angry than it is not to murder. But Matthew seems to think that people can do this. And of course it is. It is possible not to vent your wrath on somebody. I mean, it's possible not to murder somebody. It's also possible not to vent your wrath on somebody. And so it's possible not only to keep your vows, but it's also possible not to vow at all. I mean, it is humanly possible to do this, and Matthew assumes that Jesus' followers are going to act in this way, which means Matthew's Jesus is very Jewish and is insisting not that his people overthrow the law. He doesn't tell them, the law is wrong, so go ahead and commit murder, go ahead and commit adultery. He radicalizes the law and says you have to keep this radical version of the law if you expect to enter the kingdom of heaven. That's Matthew's view of things, 50 years after Jesus. Other influential early Christians, however, had other ideas, especially the Apostle Paul. It's a remarkable phenomenon that both Paul and Matthew made it into the same canon of Scripture. Both Matthew and Paul are in the New Testament. But it would be an interesting situation to see Matthew and Paul having a conversation about what they really thought following Jesus meant. Because Paul is quite adamant that following Jesus, for non-Jews at least, does not mean following the Jewish law. Paul insists that non-Jews not keep the law, in fact. He doesn't mean that non-Jews should go out and commit adultery and murder people, but he does mean that non-Jews should not practice parts of the law that make Jews Jewish. Gentiles should not go out and get circumcised. Gentiles should not keep kosher. Gentiles should not have to observe the Sabbath. Because these are things that make Jews Jewish, and Christ's salvation comes not just to Jews, but to all people, according to Paul. So that Paul's followers were not told that they have to keep the Jewish law. Paul's relationship to Jesus is a very interesting one, and understanding this will help us unpack a little bit Paul's understanding of the role of the Jewish law. Paul, as I indicated in a previous lecture, started out not as a disciple of Jesus. He didn't know the earthly Jesus. He wasn't a follower of the earthly Jesus. Paul grew up outside of Palestine. He was a Greek-speaking Jew from outside of Palestine, not an Aramaic-speaking Jew like Jesus' followers. When Paul first heard of Christianity, he was incensed by it, and he became one of the chief persecutors of the Christian church. Neither Paul nor the book of Acts actually tells us why Paul persecuted the Christian church, so we have to reconstruct and kind of read between the lines of our sources to try and figure it out. What a number of scholars think is that Paul persecuted the Christians originally precisely because they were proclaiming that Jesus was the Messiah. Well, what was the problem with that? The problem with that is that Paul, like every other Jew we know about from the first century, prior to Christianity, did not think that the Messiah was somebody who would be crucified. Who was the Messiah going to be for ancient Jews? Well, we know what ancient Jews thought about the Messiah because we have some writings from ancient Jews. My guess is most ancient Jews weren't expecting a Messiah any more than most modern Jews are expecting a Messiah. But there were Jews who were expecting Messiah, and we know about what these messianic expectations were like because of surviving Jewish writings. There were a variety of expectations of the Messiah among first-century Jews. Some Jews thought the Messiah, probably the most Jews who thought about it, thought that the Messiah would be a future political leader who would be a military man. He'd be a warrior who drove out God's enemies from the Promised Land and set up a kingdom in Israel, a sovereign state in Israel, and would rule in Jerusalem over Israel as a sovereign state, much as David, his ancestor, had done. He'd be a descendant of David who, like David, was a warrior and a king, the Messiah. There were other Jews who thought that the Messiah, in fact, would be a heavenly figure. He'd be a cosmic figure who came from heaven in judgment on the evil forces in the world who would overthrow the forces of evil and set up God's kingdom on earth. Those are two of the most prominent expectations of who the Messiah would be. In both cases, the Messiah is going to be somebody who is powerful and grand. Power and grandeur were the marks of the Messiah. Prior to Christianity, we know of no Jew who thought that the Messiah was one who was going to suffer and die. Well, why do Christians think that the Messiah is somebody who's supposed to suffer and die? Because Christians think that Jesus is the Messiah, and they know that Jesus suffered and died. Therefore, the Messiah must suffer and die. Christians point to passages in the Hebrew Bible that talk about a righteous person of God who suffers and dies, and they say this refers to the Messiah. The debate between Christians and Jews in the ancient world was over whether these passages actually were talking about the Messiah or not. Because these passages, such as Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22, that talk about somebody suffering and dying, in fact, don't ever use the term Messiah. And Jews never interpreted these passages messianically because the Messiah wasn't going to be somebody who suffered and died. He was going to be somebody who was exalted, who was powerful, who was mighty. If Jesus is the Messiah, then he must be powerful and mighty. He must be the king in Israel. He must be the one who drove out the Romans, right? Well, wrong. Jesus, in fact, didn't drive the Romans out of the Promised Land. He never raised an army. And in fact, he was arrested by the Romans and subjected to the most horrible, humiliating, painful death the Romans had devised. He was crucified as a common criminal. Most Jews thought that this claim that Jesus is the Messiah was crazy, because Jesus obviously isn't the Messiah. He's a low-life criminal who got on the bad side of the law and got crucified. Why did Paul persecute the Christians? Probably because Paul thought that their claim that Jesus was the Messiah was absolutely ludicrous and blasphemous against God. But then in one of the great turnarounds in history, Paul experienced a conversion in which he came to see that Jesus really was the Son of God. Paul claims that he had a vision of Jesus after his death, and this convinced him that Jesus was, in fact, alive. Jesus was alive. Well, how could Jesus be alive if he had been crucified? Paul starts thinking backwards from his experience, and he starts reasoning backwards, leading to the distinctive theology that Paul develops as a Christian theologian. The way the backward thinking works is this. Jesus is alive. How could he be alive? God must have raised him from the dead. How else could he be alive? Well, if God raised him from the dead, then he must be somebody who's entirely special before God. Well, if he's special before God, why did he die such a humiliating death? Well, God must have wanted him to. Why would God want him to die such a humiliating death? Well, it must not have been for anything that he had done wrong. It must have been that he died for the sake of others. Because if he's under God's special favor, then clearly God wouldn't want him to die for anything wrong he'd done, because he hadn't done anything wrong if he's under God's special favor. He must have died for others. That means that Jesus' death is for the sake of others, and it's according to God's plan that Jesus died. Well then, that must mean that a person is put into a right standing before God because Jesus died for their sins. A right standing before God, therefore, see how this backwards reasoning is working. The right standing before God then comes through Jesus' death. Well, what about the law that God gave Moses? Isn't that important for a person standing before God? Well, no, because evidently the law can't make you right with God, because if it did, God wouldn't have had Jesus die. So the law is not something that can put you in a right relationship with God, which means that whether you're a Jew who follows the law or a Gentile who doesn't even know the law, the only way to be right with God is through the death of Christ. Therefore, Gentiles don't have to keep the law in order to be right with God, because being right with God has nothing to do with keeping the law of Moses. This led then to Paul's theology as a Christian, in which he maintained that Jesus was the way to have a right standing before God, and the law of Moses was of no value for somebody's standing before God. The salvation of Jesus comes to all people, Jew and Gentile, and the law assists in no way in bringing about salvation. For Paul, therefore, the Jewish religion, in a sense, had been transcended in that now it was those who had faith in Christ who'd be right with the God of Israel. But Paul didn't see it that the Jewish religion had been transcended. He saw it that the Jewish religion had been fulfilled. This is what God had planned all along. So Paul remains Jewish, and he sees Jesus as the fulfillment of the expectation of the Jews. But the irony is the fulfillment of the Jewish law indicates that the law is not necessary for salvation. Paul had opponents who thought otherwise. If he knew Matthew might well have been one of his opponents, but Matthew lived after Paul's day. At least it's possible that Matthew would have been an opponent of Paul. Matthew does insist that the followers of Jesus are to keep the law better than the scribes and Pharisees, and Paul insists that salvation comes apart from the law. There were opponents of Paul during his lifetime that he knew about, who in fact took opposing views. For example, after Paul established the churches in the region of Galatia, which is in the central part of Asia Minor, central part of modern-day Turkey, some other Christian missionaries showed up, and these other Christian missionaries insisted that the Christians in Galatia were to be circumcised if they were to be true followers of God. God says in the Old Testament that circumcision is given as a sign of the covenant, and it's to be for all people who are to be people of the covenant, and so even followers of Jesus need to be circumcised. Paul writes his letter to the Galatians to oppose this view, which he sees as extremely dangerous. It's not just that if a person gets circumcised, they've done something that they really don't need to do. It's just an act of supererogation for Paul. It's not that. If you get circumcised, it shows that you don't believe the death of Christ is sufficient for salvation, which means you don't understand the gospel, which means you probably do not have a right standing with God. This is a very important issue for Paul. If anybody thinks that by keeping the law they have a better standing before God, they've absolutely missed the boat. In the struggles that ensued between Paul's view and other views, Paul's view and what I've called the Judaizing view of others, that thinking you have to keep the Jewish law, as you well know, Paul's views are the ones that eventually won out. By the end of the first century, most converts to the new religion of Jesus were actually not Jews, they were former pagans that Paul and others had converted. In part, Gentiles, or pagans, converted more frequently than Jews because the Christian message about Jesus never did make sense to most Jews who saw Jesus not as the promised powerful Messiah, but as a weak, crucified criminal. And of course, the Christian message continues not to make sense to most Jews. But even within Gentile circles of Christianity, there continued to be an emphasis on the need to retain the Old Testament as Scripture, even if keeping its laws could not in itself bring salvation. Why did Christians keep the Old Testament if the laws didn't bring salvation? Well, in part they kept the Old Testament because it was the Bible of Jesus and his followers, and they knew that this had started out as a Jewish sect and it had always been their Scripture, and so Christians kept it as Scripture. But there was another reason for Christians to hold on to their Jewish roots. Without their Jewish roots, Christians could appear to be a novelty on the religious scene. Christianity could be seen as an innovation. But, this is the key point, in the ancient world, new philosophies and religions were always seen as suspect and not credible. If something is new in the ancient world, it can't be right. This is quite different from the way we think of things today, where it's always the new and better that we go for. I mean, I bought a computer 2 weeks ago, and it's out of date. We want the new stuff. We don't care about the old. And new religions spring up all the time. My daughter just moved to California. I hear all about new religious movements, and it's just, just open up the yellow pages in Los Angeles sometime and look up churches. The new is better in our world. In the ancient world, the old is better. Because if it's not old, it obviously can't be true, because everybody before us got it wrong. And so the old was respected, the new was suspected. Christianity had to claim to be old in order to be respected. But Christianity wasn't old. It just started with Jesus, who was just around some years ago. Christians claimed, though, that their religion was old because their religion was true Judaism. The Jewish religion is, in fact, Christianity. The Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is a Christian book, not a Jewish book. Possibly in order to gain credibility in the world at large, or even to prevent their own persecution by Romans who were opposed to new religions, Christians claimed that they were the true heirs of the ancient religion of Israel. Well, if Christians made the claim that they were the true heirs of the true religion of Israel, what were they supposed to do about the fact that there were still Jews around who were more naturally thought to be the heirs of the religion of Israel, since they were, after all, Jews? I mean, Christians claimed to be the fulfillment of the expectations of the Hebrew Bible, and to be that Jesus was the fulfillment of the law, but Christians didn't keep the law. So, did this really make sense to Jews? Jews said, we're the heirs of the Old Testament law because, yes, we actually keep the law. And so this was a point of tension between Christians and Jews. Christians were more or less forced by the logic of their own position to go on the attack against non-Christian Jews to show that non-Christian Jews actually were apostates from the Jewish religion, and that it was Christianity, not Judaism, that was the legitimate heir to the ancient traditions of Israel. That's the context in which the letter of Barnabas and other second-century Christian anti-Jewish literature was written. We have a range of anti-Jewish literature written from the 2nd century. For example, there's a 2nd century author known as Justin Martyr. Martyr's not his last name. Martyr's what happened to him, but he's known to history as Justin Martyr. He was a Christian philosopher who was quite unforgiving towards Jews. Justin, in one of his writings that still survives, says, he's talking about circumcision, and he says circumcision can't have any bearing on salvation. He says, look, Abraham was made right with God before he was circumcised, as were the saints before Abraham. Moreover, he points out, if circumcision shows you right with God, what about women? Women aren't circumcised. Does that mean half the population can't be right with God? What's circumcision for then? He says circumcision is to cut off the Jewish people, making a pun on the term cut off, to show them as distinctive, yes. They're the ones who are distinctive so everybody knows who is to be persecuted, the Jews. So it's a physical sign of who is to undergo persecution. There were other 2nd century authors who were even more vitriolic. For example, an author named Melito, who was the bishop of the city of Sardis, who claimed that, as became popular in the 2nd century, who claimed that Jesus himself was divine. Jesus, in some sense, was God. Melito claimed that the Jewish people were responsible for Jesus' death, and Melito drew the conclusion that since Jews had killed Jesus, and since Jesus was God, the Jews had killed their own God. Well, that's a serious charge. This is the first instance in history that we know of in which the charge of deicide, the murder of God, was leveled against the Jews. Eventually, of course, this led to a very ugly history of anti-Semitism, of hatred and violence against Jews that carried on down through the Middle Ages based on the theological claims of people like Barnabas and Justin and Melito. Hatred and violence against Jews, ironically, by a Christian religion that itself started out as a sect within Judaism.